Hello, my name's Allison Wagner and I'm the food columnist for the Indiana Daily Student. This week I'm working with Audrey Perkins and we worked on a biscotti recipe that will be featured more in depth in our food front. That'll be on Wednesday. Today we're going through the recipe on our video. So now you see me adding 1.5 eggs. You can add 2 eggs if you need to. You're going to whip them until that it becomes like a scrambled egg mixture that you would be ready to make scrambled eggs with. I added 1.5 eggs, but you can add 2. We did cut this recipe in half for the purposes of the video. Now you see me adding 1.5 cups of flour. I'm going to mix that into the eggs as well. For the purposes of this video, we did cut the recipe in half. It's kind of an interesting recipe because you'll have to kind of feel it out. So while we cut the recipe in half, that would have been 1.5 eggs that we needed. But since it started to get a little bit dry at the end, as you'll see, which I'll point out to you, we decided to add in the other half of that egg. Now you see me adding 1/2 cup of sugar to the recipe. That's going to be basically what makes it sweet for you. Biscotti was one of my favorite recipes growing up. We're also going to be adding 1/4 cup of oil. You can use vegetable oil or olive oil. I used vegetable oil as that's more traditional for baking, especially for this recipe. It's a lot better to just use vegetable oil, and it's easier to get your hands on. Alright, now we're going to be adding the vanilla flavoring. Traditionally, biscotti use anise. I'm not a big fan of anise, and it can also be difficult to find in your local grocery store and be a little bit expensive. So normally this recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of vanilla and 1 teaspoon of anise. I did 1 teaspoon of vanilla and an extra teaspoon of vanilla to substitute for the anise flavoring. I don't think it really changes it that much, but some people would argue differently. We wanted to make an almond flavored biscotti, so we decided to use an almond extract. I added 2 teaspoons of almond extract to the half recipe. If you were doing a full recipe, I would recommend adding 3 teaspoons of almond extract. You can also substitute the extract for actual chopped almonds. You would want to do about 3/4 to a cup of that. You can also just add the almonds in with the almond extract if you want that type of nutty crunch in there. The important part to remember is to add the baking powder. Not baking soda, baking powder. That's what's going to create the perfect consistency. We added 1 teaspoon of baking powder to the recipe. While I'm getting this out and putting the baking powder in, let's talk a little bit about the history of biscotti. So biscotti is actually the Italian word for cookies. It's called something very different in Italy, but we call it biscotti here in America. That's what we know it as. Biscotti is also more of a bread, so while most people assume it's a cookie, it's actually more of a sweeter bread that's going to be twice baked. So as you see me mixing it, it's not mixing quite as thicker together that I want it to. So I'm eventually going to add here that other 1/2 egg because that's going to make it a little bit thicker and stick together. It's a little dry right now. If you do add that other part of the egg and it's still dry, I would recommend just adding a teaspoon of oil for it. Now what you're going to do is flour a cutting board, just a little flour, you don't want it too thick. And then we're going to take out the dough ball and put that onto the cutting board. And we're going to start shaping it into a loaf. If you made the full recipe, you would want to split the dough into 2 parts. But first what you're going to need to do is knead the dough. For about a minute is all you really need to do. And then as you're done with that, it's time to start shaping it into a loaf. It goes into more of a circle. It's about 1 inch thick. You'll see me kneading it just a little bit more. And that's how I start to form it into the loaf. We want to make it more into a ball first, just like that, and keep rolling it, just working with it. Make sure there's no kinks, that there's no cuts in it. There we go, just a little bit more. Alright. As the flour starts to disappear from the board, you'll know that it's about ready to start shaping. As you can see, I have it only about 1 inch thick because it's not going to rise too much in the oven. And the thicker it is, the longer it's going to take to bake, and the inside of your biscotti are going to be very, very wet, and it's supposed to be a very, very dry cookie. So we transferred it onto a greased baking sheet, just lightly greased with Pam or your normal cooking spray. Reshape it onto the pan a little bit, just so that it's back in that circle that you would like it to be. And you're going to place it into the oven at 350 and take it out at 25 to 30 minutes. You're going to start slicing the slices at an angle with a serrated edged knife. You want your slices to be about 1 inch thick. The thicker they are, the harder they are to eat. I sliced from both ends just because it's easier to get the cuts. Sometimes the difficult part about biscotti is they can be difficult to cut since you're taking it directly out of the warm oven, slicing it, and putting it right back in. Some of the pieces kind of break every now and then, but they're still going to taste the same, I promise. As you might be able to tell, it is a little wet in the middle, but that's okay because it's only a little bit. It's just a little sliver of wetness, and when we put it back into the oven, it's going to dry right up. You can see the crumbles. It's very, very, very perfect. Alright, now we're going to take our baking sheet and start placing the pieces back onto the greased baking sheet. You don't need to re-grease it. You're going to lay them on your sides so that the part that was enclosed in the loaf is now exposed when it's put back into the oven. This is going to allow that twice baking effect and make your biscotti a lot crunchier. I usually put it back in the oven for about 5 minutes or until it's brown on the top and all the moisture is absorbed, but if you need to, you can bring them a little bit longer. You're going to take them out and they're going to be ready to eat.